The day Elsie Redmond buried her husband in the cold Pennsylvania earth, she made herself a single promise, that she would not die in the same ground that had taken everything from her. It was the autumn of 1873, and the world east of the Mississippi had grown heavy with debt, drought, and the particular cruelty of men who wore suits and carried ledgers like weapons. Thomas Redmond had been a good man, a farmer with honest hands and a laugh that filled rooms, but the bank had not cared about his laugh when it came for his land, and the fever that took him 3 months later had not cared about his goodness. He was 34 years old when they lowered him into the ground, and Elsie was 31, and her children, Clara, who was 9, and William, who had just turned 7, and baby James, who was barely 3, stood beside her in the November wind wearing coats too thin for the season, because the bank had taken almost everything and what was left would not last the winter. She sold what remained. The plow, the old mule named Barley, 2 quilts her mother had made, and a silver-handled hairbrush that Thomas had given her on their wedding day, which she held for a long time before she put it on the table for strangers to pick up and carry away. She kept the children's clothes, a Bible, a small iron pot, a photograph of Thomas in a tin frame, and $42 in coin that she wrapped inside a wool stocking and pinned inside her dress where it pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Her sister-in-law Ruth offered her a room and pity in equal measure, and Elsie endured both for 6 weeks before she could no longer sit inside Ruth's neat little parlor listening to the clock tick and the quiet suggestion that she might remarry someone local, someone settled, someone who would take on a widow and 3 small children as a charitable act. There was a man named Gerald Hutchins who owned a dry goods store and had already buried 2 wives, and Ruth brought him up at supper with the careful brightness of someone who believed she was doing a kindness. Elsie thanked her, excused herself from the table, and that night by candlelight wrote a letter to an advertisement she had clipped from a newspaper 3 weeks earlier and hidden in the spine of her Bible. The advertisement had been placed by a land agent in Dodge City, Kansas, and it described parcels of homestead land available under the terms of the Homestead Act of 1862, amended and expanded, offering 160 acres to any head of household willing to settle, cultivate, and improve the land for a period of 5 years. She had read the advertisement so many times that the words had worn grooves into her mind. 160 acres, Kansas, West. She was not naive. She had heard the stories, the prairie fires, the locust plagues, the distances that swallowed men whole, the winters that were a different kind of cold than Pennsylvania winters, a flat, merciless cold with nothing to stop the wind for 500 miles. She had heard those stories, and she had weighed them against Ruth's parlor and Gerald Hutchins, and the slow suffocation of a life lived entirely on the charity of people who were already a little tired of you. And she had decided that the prairie could do its worst, and she would still take her chances with it. She told Ruth and her brother-in-law Henry at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in February of 1874, and the silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the snow settling on the window glass. Ruth said that she was being reckless. Henry said that a woman alone with children had no business going west. Elsie said that she was going anyway, and asked if someone could drive her and the children to the train station in the morning, and the silence came again, different this time, and heavier. The train ride from Philadelphia to St. Louis took 2 days, and felt like the longest distance she had ever traveled, though she knew the real distance was still ahead of her. Clara sat with her nose pressed to the window and narrated everything she saw with the cheerful relentlessness of a 9-year-old who believed she was on an adventure. William was quieter, more watchful, and Elsie caught him sometimes studying her face with a seriousness that was too old for 7, reading her for signs of fear the way a sailor reads the sky. Baby James slept on her lap for most of the journey and woke up wanting biscuits, and she gave him pieces of the hard bread she had packed and kissed the top of his head and told herself she was not afraid. She was, of course. She was terrified in the bone-deep way that does not announce itself as terror, but settles instead into the hands and the jaw and the careful control of breathing. And she managed it the same way she managed everything, by looking only as far ahead as the next necessary thing, and refusing to let her mind run all the way to the end of the road and everything that could go wrong there. Incent. Louis, she spent 2 nights at a boarding house and purchased supplies: flour, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, matches, a good wool blanket, and a used Winchester rifle from a man at a hardware store who looked at her with the particular skepticism men reserved for women who bought firearms, and she looked back at him without blinking until he wrapped it for her. She knew how to shoot. Thomas had taught her, years ago, and she had been a better shot than he was, which had made him proud in a way that said something good about who he had been. From St. Louis she took the Kansas Pacific Railroad west, and the land changed around her in a way that was genuinely startling, the trees thinning and then disappearing, the sky expanding until it was something she had never seen before, a bowl of blue so enormous it seemed to press down on everything beneath it with a kind of magnificent indifference. Clara stopped narrating and simply stared. William put his face against the window. Even James was quiet, his eyes going wide and solemn. Elsie looked out at that enormous country and felt something shift inside her chest, something she could not quite name. It was not peace exactly, and it was not happiness, but it was something adjacent to possibility, the sense that in a place this large a person might become something new, might shed the old shape of their grief and grow into whatever the land required, and she pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and thought, all right then, all right. She arrived in Dodge City, Kansas, in the second week of March, 1874, with $31 left after train fare and supplies, 3 children, a rifle, an iron pot, and the particular determination of a woman who has decided that the only direction left is forward. Dodge City was everything she had been told, and a few things she had not. It was loud and dusty, and smelled of cattle and horses and wood smoke, and something underneath all of that, something that was simply the smell of a place that had not yet decided what it was going to be. The cattle drives had made it famous and rough and prosperous in the chaotic way of places where money moves fast and law moves slower. She walked from the train station with her children close around her and her back very straight and her chin level, and she found the land agent's office on the main street between a saloon and a blacksmith, which seemed to her a reasonable set of neighbors for the beginning of a new life. The land agent was a small, bespectacled man named Mr. Aldous Crane, who smelled of tobacco, and seemed genuinely surprised to see a woman standing in his doorway with 3 children and a rifle case. He recovered quickly, which she credited him for, and he spread maps on his desk and explained the available homestead parcels in the county with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it many times. She asked good questions about water sources, about soil quality, about the nearest neighbors and the distance to town, and he answered them with increasing respect, and by the end of the conversation they had identified a 160-acre parcel 18 miles southwest of Dodge, along a small creek called Garrison Creek, with a rudimentary structure already on it, a single-room sod house built by a previous homesteader who had given up the winter before and gone back to Ohio. The filing fee was $14. She paid it, signed her name in a clear hand, and walked out of the office a landowner, which was a word she turned over in her mind the whole walk back to the boarding house where she had left her children with the landlady, testing its weight and finding it heavy in a way that felt like solid ground rather than burden. She spent 4 days in Dodge organizing her departure. She needed a wagon and a team, which was her largest remaining expense, and she found what she could afford at a livery stable, a serviceable but aging farm wagon and 2 horses, a bay mare named by the previous owner as Duchess and a gray gelding with no name at all whom William immediately named Fox because of the pointed look of his ears, and the name stuck. She loaded her supplies and her children, and on a Thursday morning in mid-March, with the sky clear and cold, and the prairie stretching away in every direction like a question that expected an answer. She drove her wagon southwest out of Dodge City toward the land that was now legally hers. The 18 miles took the better part of the day. The road, such as it was, faded to a track and then to the suggestion of a track, and she navigated by the landmarks the land agent had described, and by the position of the sun, and by something that might have been instinct or might have been desperation, wearing the mask of instinct. She arrived at Garrison Creek in the late afternoon, the sun already dropping toward the flat horizon, and she saw the sod house sitting on a low rise above the creek, squat and dark, and not much larger than a generous chicken coop, and she sat in the wagon for a moment looking at it with her children pressed around her. "Is that our house?" Clara asked. "That is our house," Elsie said. "It is very small," William said, with the diplomatic tone of a child trying to be honest without being unkind. "It will be warmer than a big house," she told him, "and we will make it larger." She did not say when, she did not say how. She climbed down from the wagon, and the 3 children climbed down behind her, and James held her hand as they walked up the rise together, and she pushed open the low door of the sod house and looked inside at the packed earth floor and the single window with its oilskin covering and the stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and the rough wooden shelves and the smell of dust and abandonment and cold, and she took a breath and said, "Well, let us get the fire going." She had the fire going within the hour. She fed her children dried beans cooked with salt pork and hard bread softened in the pot liquor, and she put James to bed on the folded blanket and lay beside him listening to the prairie wind against the thick sod walls, and Clara and William fell asleep pressed together like puppies on the other side of the small space, and Elsie lay awake in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind and thinking about water, and seeds, and the cold, and the distance to town, and the sound of nothing for 18 miles in every direction. And she did not let herself cry because crying required something she could not afford to spend. The first 3 weeks were the hardest of her life and also, in some dark and difficult way, clarifying. She discovered what she was made of by being stripped to the essential requirements of survival, and what she found was that she was made of something tougher than she had known. She hauled water from the creek in 2 buckets morning and evening. She broke ground for a kitchen garden with a hand spade because she had not yet acquired a proper plow, and the Kansas soil was harder than she expected and softer in other places, where the spring thaw had made it uncertain, and she worked until her hands bled and then wrapped them and worked again. She hunted twice a week, going out before dawn with the Winchester while Clara watched her brothers, and she was good enough to bring back rabbits, and once a prairie chicken that James regarded with such intense suspicion that it made everyone laugh, and laughter in that small sod house in that enormous flat country felt like a kind of wealth. She also discovered, slowly and then all at once, how much she did not know. She did not know how to properly bank a sod house for the remaining spring cold, and the first week she woke twice to find frost on the inside of the walls and James shivering. She did not know which of the prairie grasses were good signs for soil and which were not. She did not know how to read the sky for weather in the particular way that Kansas required, where a storm could come from nothing in the space of an hour. She did not know her neighbors, because the nearest homestead was 7 miles east, and she had not yet had reason or time to go there. It was a broken wagon wheel that changed everything. She was driving to Dodge City for supplies in the first week of April when the right rear wheel hit a rock hidden in the new spring grass and cracked clean through the hub. And the wagon listed hard, and she pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down and looked at the damage with the calm, controlled fury of a person who knows that panic is a luxury they cannot afford. She was 8 miles from Dodge and 10 miles from home, and she had James on the wagon seat beside her and Clara and William in the bed, and she had perhaps 3 hours of daylight left, and the wheel was finished. She was standing there looking at it, calculating, when she heard the horse. He came from the north, riding at an easy lope on a tall roan stallion, and he slowed when he saw her and the broken wagon. And even from a distance she could see the careful way he read the situation. The woman, the children, the broken wheel, the time of day. Before he eased his horse to a walk and came the rest of the way at a pace that was unhurried and deliberately non-threatening, which she noticed and appreciated. Roy Sheridan was 35 years old and had spent the last 8 years as a rancher in Comanche County, though he had started out as a working cowboy in Texas before that. And before that was a life in Missouri that he did not often discuss. He was not a large man, but he was solidly built, the kind of build that comes from actual work rather than size, and he had the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outside, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that were a quiet, watchful brown that reminded Elsie, for a reason she could not immediately identify, of still water. He wore a battered, wide-brimmed hat and a working man's clothes, denim and canvas, and a flannel shirt under a worn leather vest, and he had a Colt revolver on his hip in a working holster that was not decorative, and a coiled rope on his saddle, and the general appearance of a man who was exactly what he appeared to be, which was a significant relief. "Evening," he said, stopping his horse about 10 feet away and touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular ease of someone who had learned long ago that there was very little worth rushing. "That wheel looks to have given up on you." "It has," she said. She kept her posture level and her voice even, the rifle case visible in the wagon, not pointed at anyone, simply present in the way a practical woman made sure practical things were present. He looked at the wheel and then at the sky and then at her children, and he did not look at her the way some men looked at her, with the evaluating, proprietary interest that made her feel like a problem to be solved or a resource to be assessed, but rather in the straightforward, considerate way of someone who was simply sizing up a situation that required assistance. "I've got some tools," he said. "And I've got a spare wheel pin in my saddlebag, though that wheel will still need a proper fix in town. But I can rig something that'll get you somewhere that isn't the middle of the road." "I would be grateful for that," she said. He swung down from his horse with the economical movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and he tied the roan to the wagon and opened his saddlebag, and came out with a rolled canvas tool kit and the wheel pin, and he went to work without further commentary, crouching down beside the broken wheel, and examining it with the quiet focus of someone who took competence seriously. Clara had climbed down from the wagon and was watching him with the frank, relentless curiosity of a 9-year-old, and William watched from the wagon bed with his arms crossed, and James had fallen asleep against Elsie's shoulder. "You're the new homesteader," Roy said, not looking up from the wheel. "Garrison Creek parcel." "I am," she said. "Elsie Redmond." "Roy Sheridan." He looked up briefly and nodded. "My ranch is 12 miles north. Word gets around out here. People notice the smoke from the creek." "Is that a problem?" She asked it evenly, without defensiveness, simply wanting to know the territory. He looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression that was almost the beginning of a smile, though it did not quite become one. "No, Mrs. Redmond," he said. "It is not a problem. It is considerably less of a problem than this wheel." She almost smiled herself. She turned away so he would not see it. He worked for 40 minutes, and he was good at it. Methodical and careful, not showy, not the kind of man who needed an audience to demonstrate competence. He rigged a temporary fix with the wheel pin and a strip of iron from his tool kit and a section of rawhide from his saddlebag. And when he was done, he stood and tested it and pronounced it sufficient to get her to the closest homestead, which was the Garrity place, 7 miles east, where they had a proper forge and could set her up for the night and help her get the wheel repaired in the morning. "I know where the Garrity place is," she said. "I have not had occasion to call on them yet." "They're good people," he said. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her, and there was a directness to his gaze that was not uncomfortable, not the kind of directness that demands something, but the kind that simply sees clearly. "You've been at Garrison Creek 3 weeks on your own." It was not a question. "I have," she said. "Anything you need that I can help with before I send you on your way." She thought about the dozen things she needed, the 100 things she did not know, and she said, "The soil near the creek. What does it want to grow?" He looked at her for a moment, and this time the smile did arrive, brief and genuine, and lighting the lines of his face in a way that made him look younger and more himself than he had the moment before. "Corn," he said, "and sorghum, and whatever you want to plant near the water. The dry ground north of your rise will take winter wheat if you can get it in before June." "Thank you," she said. "You're a long way from home, Mrs. Redmond." "I am home," she said, and she said it without hesitation or performance, simply as a fact, and she saw something flicker in his expression, recognition. She thought, or something close to it, as though she had said something he understood in a way that went past the words themselves. He helped her get back onto the wagon seat, and he rode alongside her the first 2 miles to make sure the repair held, and then he touched his hat and turned north and rode away across the prairie, and Elsie watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then turned her horses east toward the Garrity place. The Garritys were, as Roy had said, good people. Margaret Garrity was a broad-shouldered, cheerful woman in her 40s who had been homesteading in Kansas for 6 years, and had the particular knowledge base of someone who had learned everything the hard way, and was happy to share what they knew. Her husband James was quiet and kind, and had their forge fired up by 8 the next morning to fix the wagon wheel. Margaret fed Elsie's children a breakfast of cornbread and gravy that made James's eyes close with pleasure, and she sat Elsie down at her kitchen table with coffee, and talked to her for 3 hours about the land, and the seasons and the crops and the water table and the neighbors, and the particular challenges of being a woman homesteading alone. And Elsie wrote things down in a small notebook she carried and asked questions and felt, for the first time since Thomas had died, as though she might actually know what she was doing. She asked, at some point in the middle of the conversation, about Roy Sheridan. Margaret looked at her coffee cup and then at Elsie with a gentle, measuring expression. "Roy is about the best man in the county," she said, "which is not a small thing because the county has some good men in it. He's been out here 8 years, built his ranch from nothing. He's decent with his neighbors, which not all of them are, and he's fair with his hands, which even fewer of them are." She paused. "He was married years back, before Kansas. His wife died in childbirth, the baby too. He's been on his own since." Elsie looked into her coffee. "I see," she said. "He doesn't talk about it," Margaret said, "but he's not hard because of it. Some men get hard that way. Roy just got careful, like someone who's learned how much things can cost." Elsie understood that exactly. She said nothing, but she understood it in the particular way of someone who had learned the same lesson by a different road. Roy Sheridan came back. She had not expected him to. She had filed him in the category of decent people she had briefly met, and she had driven home from the Garritys with her repaired wheel and her head full of practical information, and her notebook full of useful things, and she had gone back to her work and her children and the daily arithmetic of survival on the Kansas prairie. He came 12 days later on a Sunday afternoon, riding up to the sod house on the roan with a pack horse behind him, carrying a proper plow and 2 bags of seed corn, and a sack of winter wheat seed, and a small crate that turned out to contain 6 chickens of bad temper but excellent breeding, all of which he unloaded with the same unhurried efficiency he had shown with the broken wheel. Elsie stood in the doorway of the sod house and watched him unload, and felt something she recognized as the particular overwhelm of an unexpected kindness, the kind that lands when your defenses are low, because you have been too busy surviving to keep them properly maintained. "What is all of this?" she asked. "Plow belongs to a neighbor who moved on last fall," he said. "He left it with me to do with as I saw fit. Seeds from my own stock, corn and wheat, should do well in your soil." He set the chicken crate down and looked at it with a slight expression of displeasure. "The chickens are bad-tempered, but they're good layers. I won't pretend otherwise about either quality." "Roy," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his given name without thinking and was not sure what to do with that now that it was out. He looked at her and did not seem to find anything unusual about it. "Yes. Why?" she asked. It was a simple question, and she asked it the simple way, without accusation or coyness, just wanting to know. He thought about it for a moment. He was not a man who gave easy answers to serious questions. She was learning. "Because you're trying to do something hard," he said, "and having good tools makes hard things harder to fail at. And because your children deserve a winter with eggs." He paused. "And because I rode out once and I wanted a reason to come back." The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people who have both learned to be careful with words allow to exist without rushing to fill it. "Stay for supper," she said. It was not an impulsive offer. She meant it, and she said it with the straightforward directness that was her natural register, and he accepted with the same quality. He ate supper at the small table she had built from planks salvaged from the previous homesteader's abandoned wood pile, and her children arranged themselves around him with the unself-conscious interest of children who had been largely isolated and found a new person extremely interesting. Clara talked to him about everything she had observed in Kansas so far with the comprehensive authority of a 9-year-old who considered herself a credible naturalist, and he listened to her with genuine attention and asked her questions that were good questions, which raised him considerably in her estimation. William asked him about his horse. James, who had inherited Thomas's instinct for judging character, climbed into his lap after supper with the authority of a child who had made a decision, and Roy sat very still for a moment, and then settled his arm around the boy with a gentleness that made Elsie look away quickly at the dishes. After the children were in bed, she made coffee and they sat on opposite sides of the table in the lamplight, and they talked. They talked about the land first, practical things, the crops, the water, the coming season, the proper way to bank a sod house for summer heat, the places along Garrison Creek where the soil was best and worst. Then they talked about the country, about Kansas and what it was becoming, about the cattle trade and the railroad, and what both of those things meant for the homesteaders trying to stake a claim in the middle of all that movement and money and competing interest. She was intelligent and opinionated and did not moderate either quality for politeness, and he seemed to find that not only unobjectionable but actively enjoyable. Then, gradually, without ceremony, they talked about other things. He told her about his ranch and how he had built it, the first years of it, the mistakes and the corrections and the slow accumulation of something worth keeping. She told him about Pennsylvania and Thomas, not the grief of it but the substance of it, who Thomas had been and what their life together had been. And she spoke of it directly and without the apologetic softness people often expected from widows, and he received it the same way, without pity or awkward condolence, simply as the real history of a real person, which was all she had ever wanted anyone to do with it. He left when the moon was high, and he rode away north across the prairie, and she stood in the doorway of the sod house listening to the horses' hoofbeats fade into the dark and the wind, and she thought about Margaret Garrity saying like someone who learned how much things can cost, and she thought that she understood him, and that understanding had arrived with an unexpected ease, as though the shape of him had been somehow familiar before she had known him long enough to explain why. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. They fell into a rhythm that neither of them named, because naming things too soon is a way of scaring them off. He would arrive Sunday afternoons with some practical thing. Once it was window glass to replace the oilskin on the single window, which made the sod house suddenly feel different, larger and lighter, and more like a real home. Once it was a proper door latch because the old one was failing. Once it was just himself and a bag of apples from a tree he had found growing along the creek on his north boundary, and the children ate them with such pure joy that he looked at them with an expression that Elsie caught from across the room, a complicated, tender expression that he probably did not know his face was making, and she turned to stir the pot on the fire so she would not be looking at him when he thought he was alone with whatever that expression was. He helped her plant. He came 3 days in a row in mid-April, and they worked side by side in the fields, she driving the plow with Fox and Duchess, and he breaking the clods and setting the seed rows. And they worked in a comfortable near silence broken by necessary words and occasional conversation that built in both of them. She thought, the kind of familiarity that comes from sharing labor, real labor, the kind that requires your whole body and your full attention, that builds something actual and leaves you both tired and satisfied in the evening. One afternoon, driving the plow along the north field, she hit a buried stone and the plow lurched, and she lost her footing and went down hard on one knee in the turned earth. And Roy was beside her before she had processed what happened, his hand under her elbow, his face close to hers for a moment with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, something urgent and concentrated. And then when she said she was fine and meant it, the expression reorganized itself and he stepped back and resumed the careful, respectful distance he kept. But the moment had existed, and they both knew it had. May came, and the prairie came alive in a way that genuinely took her breath away. She had not been prepared for the beauty of it. She had expected utility, the flat functional land of cattle and crops, and she had found instead something that operated on a scale of beauty she did not have existing vocabulary for, the grass going from pale gold to green in what seemed like days, the wildflowers coming in great sweeping patches of color across the rolling plain, the sky doing things at dawn and dusk that she found herself stopping work to stare at in a way that Thomas had always said she did, whenever something surprised her into stillness. Clara pressed wildflowers in the Bible between pages of Psalms, and James chased grasshoppers with determined inefficiency, and William, who was becoming a quiet, observant, capable boy, helped his mother with the water hauling without being asked and watched the land the same way she did. Roy took William fishing one Saturday morning at a bend in Garrison Creek, where catfish ran in the spring, and they came back in the afternoon with a dozen fish, and William talking more than Elsie had heard him talk since Thomas died, and Roy listened to every word with the patient, genuine interest he seemed to extend naturally to anyone who was speaking to him. And that night after the children were in bed and Roy was still at the table with his coffee, Elsie said, "You're very good with them." He looked at his coffee. "They're easy to be good with," he said. "They're good children." "They are," she said, "but it's not only that." She paused, considering how to say it. "Some men are uncomfortable with children, particularly someone else's children." He looked up at her and the quiet brown eyes held something that she was beginning to learn to read, a kind of deliberate honesty that he offered in the place of easy words. "I don't think of them as someone else's," he said. "I think of them as yours, and that makes them—" He stopped. "What?" she asked. "Important," he said. The words settled between them and neither of them moved for a long moment, and the lamp flame was steady between them on the table, and outside, the prairie night went on forever in every direction. And Elsie thought about the $42 in the wool stocking, and the photograph of Thomas and the land agent's office, and the particular winding road of grief and necessity that had brought her here to this small lamplit sod house on the Kansas prairie, 18 miles from nowhere, sitting across from a man who thought of her children as important because they were hers. And she thought that the world sometimes works in ways that are entirely too large to see until you are already inside. She did not say any of this. She said, "More coffee, please," he said. But she knew, and she thought he knew, that something had shifted. June brought heat and work and a locust scare that turned out to be a false alarm, a cloud moving south of them, and 3 trips to Dodge City for supplies. And on one of those trips Roy accompanied her and the children, riding alongside the wagon, and she noticed the way people in town read them together, the looks and the small adjustments of expression that told her how they appeared to others, and she found she minded it less than she expected to. In Dodge City, she met a woman named Harriet Coles who had been homesteading alone for 4 years, and who told Elsie things about the county and the territory with a blunt, comprehensive frankness that Elsie deeply appreciated, and also said, in passing, while watching Roy help William down from the wagon on the other side of the street, "Roy Sheridan has not been to town with a woman in 8 years. You should know that." Elsie considered this. "I should know it because it is meaningful or because it will occasion gossip." "Both," Harriet said cheerfully, "but mostly the first." The corn was knee-high by the 4th of July, and the wheat was coming in on the north field, and the 6 bad-tempered chickens had produced a 7th through a series of events Elsie chose not to investigate. And the garden along the creek had tomatoes and squash and beans, and a row of sunflowers that James had planted with intense personal investment, and checked on every morning with the solemnity of someone monitoring an important project. That evening, the 4th of July, Roy built a fire down at the creek, and he and Elsie sat beside it with the children running in the warm dark catching fireflies. And the flat black sky above them was enormous and covered in stars in the particular dense way of Kansas skies, where there is nothing for hundreds of miles to compete with the stars. And they sat side by side in the firelight and talked for a long time about nothing urgent and everything real. The way two people talk when they are becoming truly comfortable with each other. Comfortable in the way that includes silence and does not require performance. At some point the children slept, Clara and William together against a tree root and James on the blanket Roy had spread on the grass, and the fire had died to coals, and Elsie said, out of nowhere and everywhere at once, "I am not the same person I was when Thomas was alive." Roy looked at her. "No," he said, "I do not know if that is loss or." She stopped. "Both," he said. "It is always both." She looked at the coals. The creek moved quietly in the dark behind them. "Margaret Garrity told me about your wife," she said. She said it gently and directly because she was a direct person, and she did not believe in dancing around the things that were real. "I am sorry." He was quiet for a moment. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but it doesn't leave, does it? It just changes shape." "Yes," she said, "it changes shape." She looked at him in the coal's light, his profile still and the quiet night all around them. "Roy." "Elsie," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how anyone had said her name in a long time. Not the way Ruth had said it, with that undercurrent of concern that was really concern about herself, and not the way strangers said it, and not even the way Thomas had said it at the end, when he was already so tired, but the way her name might sound to someone who said it because they wanted to, because it meant something to say it. "I think I need to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her and she looked at him, and the firelight was between them and the stars were everywhere above them, and she said, "I came west with nothing except my children and the very bare hope that I could make something from land and stubbornness, and I did not come expecting anything or anyone to help me with that, and I do not need anyone to help me with it, and you need to understand that first." "I understand it," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "But I would be lying," she said, "if I said that Sundays have not become the day I wait for." The silence was very complete, and then he said, low and quiet and certain, "They are that for me too." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I do not know what that makes us." "I think," he said slowly, "that it makes us two people who have both had something taken from them and found something here instead." He paused. "And I think it means that I would like very much to ask you to dinner in Dodge City next Saturday, if you would allow it." She looked at him then, and the thing that happened with her face was not the careful, neutral expression she had been maintaining for months, the expression that said she was managing perfectly well and required nothing from anyone, but something quieter and more real, the expression that her face made when she stopped managing it. "I would allow it," she said. He almost smiled, and then he did smile, fully this time, and it changed his whole face the way sunlight changes a field, and she thought she had not seen him smile like that before, and she wanted to see it again. And that wanting was so simple and so entirely new that it surprised her. They went to dinner in Dodge City the following Saturday, and they left the children with Margaret Garrity, who made this arrangement with the comfortable efficiency of someone who has been waiting for it and is entirely pleased to see it come about. They ate at the hotel dining room, which was the best restaurant in town, and they dressed for it, she in the one good dress she had brought from Pennsylvania, a dark blue wool with a white collar that she had pressed with careful attention to the task, and he in a clean white shirt and a good jacket and his best hat. And when he came to collect her in his wagon and saw her in the dress, he removed his hat and said, "You look very fine, Elsie," with the direct simplicity of a man who does not offer compliments carelessly, and she felt it land accordingly. Over dinner they talked with a freedom that the presence of children, beloved as they were, did not always allow, and she learned things about him she had not known, that he had read more than you would guess from looking at him, that he had an opinion about the cattle trade and the railroad that was thoughtful and specific, and not what the big operators wanted to hear. He had grown up poor in rural Missouri in a way that had not made him bitter, but had made him careful with money and respectful of work, any work, in a way that she recognized because poverty taught you to recognize it in each other. He asked about her childhood in Pennsylvania, and she told him about her father, who had been a school teacher, and about the books in his study that she had spent her childhood moving through like a very small person in a very large country, and about how she had intended to teach before she married and might intend to teach still someday, when the homestead was settled enough to think about more than immediate survival. He looked at her steadily when she said that. "You would be a good teacher," he said. "How would you know that?" "Because I have watched you teach your children every day for 3 months," he said. "The way you explain things to them. The way you answer their questions as though the questions are worth answering." She looked at him across the restaurant table with the lamplight between them and the sounds of Dodge City doing its loud, complicated evening business around them, and she thought that she was in considerable trouble, and the trouble had a name and a pair of quiet brown eyes, and a habit of seeing her exactly as she was, which she had not experienced often enough to be entirely prepared for its effect. Walking back to the wagon in the warm summer evening, he offered her his arm and she took it, and the simple physical reality of it, the solidity of his arm under her hand, the warmth of him beside her in the dark street, struck her with an intensity she had not anticipated, and she was glad of the dark to conceal whatever her face was doing. He drove her home under the stars and brought the wagon to the sod house and walked her to the door, and at the door he stopped and turned to her and said, with the same directness and care that characterized everything he did, "I would like to court you properly, Elsie, if you would have that." She looked at him in the moonlight, this careful, honest, capable, unexpectedly tender man who had ridden out of the prairie with a wheel pin and seed corn and bad-tempered chickens, and had somehow, in the space of these months, become the axis around which her Sundays and then her weeks and then her thoughts arranged themselves, and she said, "Yes, I would have that." He took her hand and held it for a moment, just that, held her hand in the warm dark outside the sod house, and then he said good night and rode north across the prairie, and she stood in the door and watched him go and felt something she had not felt in a long time, something that was not survival or determination or the hard-won competence of managing alone, but something lighter and more alarming and considerably more enjoyable, and she put her hand on the doorframe and said, very quietly to no one in particular, "Well, there it is." He courted her as he did everything with deliberateness and honesty, and a respect for the reality of her life that never made her feel like a project or a cause, but simply like a woman he wanted to be around, for reasons that were entirely about her, and not about what she represented or what he might need. He came more often than Sundays now, and sometimes he brought his hired man, an elderly Mexican rancher named Eduardo who had been with Roy for 5 years and had a talent for carpentry. And between the 3 of them, they added a second room to the sod house, a proper lumber-framed addition that Roy purchased at the mill in Dodge and hauled out himself. And when it was finished, Clara had a room of her own with a window that faced east and caught the morning light, which she said with great dignity was exactly what she had been hoping for. He built them a proper outhouse. He repaired the fence line along the creek. He showed William how to properly care for the horses, the real way, the patient, detailed way that would serve a boy well his whole life. And William absorbed this information with the concentrated seriousness of someone who intends to use it, which in fact he did. He brought James a carved wooden horse that Eduardo had made, and James carried it everywhere for the rest of that summer and would not be separated from it even for sleep. But more than any of the practical things, what he gave her was his company, the simple, extraordinary gift of consistent, genuine, non-conditional company. They talked every time he came, and the talking was the kind that builds something, not the performance of conversation, but the real exchange of two people becoming known to each other. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the night Thomas died, about the specific quality of her fear in the first weeks on the prairie, about the hairbrush she had sold, and how she still thought of it sometimes with a grief that surprised her by its specificity. He told her about his wife Mary, about who she had been and how he had loved her, and how the loss of her had been a thing that had reorganized him at the level of what he believed was possible, and how he had decided, somewhere in the years that followed, that it was better to want small things, certain things, things that could not be taken, and how he had not been sure that was a sustainable way to live and was becoming less sure of it by the week. "Is that what I am?" she asked one evening in early September, the harvest coming and the air just starting to carry the first suggestion of the fall that was coming, something you are becoming less certain you want to keep at a careful distance. He looked at her with an expression that was so completely unguarded that it startled her. "Elsie," he said, "you are not something I am managing the distance of. You are something I am not sure I know how to be without any more. And that is a different and considerably more frightening thing." She put down what she had been doing, which was mending a shirt of William's at the table, and she looked at him across the lamp and she said, "It is not frightening from where I am sitting." "No," he said. "From where I am sitting," she said, "it looks like the only thing that makes sense." He rose from his chair and she rose from hers, and they were very close together in the small golden room, and he put his hands on her face, gentle and careful and entirely certain, and she put her hands flat against his chest and felt his heart under her palms, and he said her name once, just her name, the way he said it that was different from everyone else, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, unhurried, the kind of kiss that does not demand anything but offers everything, and she felt it from her mouth to the soles of her feet, and she held on to the front of his shirt with both hands because the floor felt temporarily uncertain, and when they drew apart she kept her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them to look at him, and what she found on his face was the same thing she suspected was on hers, a kind of astonished gladness. Wonder at the ordinary miracle of finding your way to a person who makes the world make more sense. "Elsie Redmond," he said, very quietly, his forehead against hers, "I would like to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "Will you marry me?" She breathed in the smell of him, horses and wood smoke and the clean outdoor smell of a man who worked the land, and she thought about the blue wool dress and the hairbrush and the $42 in the wool stocking, and the night she had promised herself she would not die in the same ground that had taken everything. And she thought about the plow arriving on a pack horse and bad-tempered chickens and a carved wooden horse and windows facing east and her children's faces on Sunday afternoons. And she said, "Yes. Roy Sheridan, I will marry you." He made a sound that was low and rough and entirely involuntary, and he pulled her close and held her with the careful, controlled intensity of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has finally, with full permission, let it come in, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her cheek, steady and certain. And outside the Kansas night went on forever in every direction, and the stars were everywhere, and the creek ran in the dark, and the corn stood in the east field as tall as William's shoulder. They told the children the next morning at breakfast. Clara received the news with the considered, analytical expression of someone who has been expecting something and is deciding whether their prediction has been correctly fulfilled, and then produced a smile of such enormous satisfaction that it was clear she had been hoping for this specific outcome for some time, and was pleased to see the adults had managed to arrive at it. "I knew it," she announced, with 9-year-old certainty. William looked at Roy for a long moment and then said, with the directness of a boy who asked important questions plainly, "Will you live here with us?" Roy looked at him steadily. "I would like us to all live together, William. You and Clara and James and your mother and me, on this land or mine or wherever makes the most sense for all of us. But that is a conversation we will all have together because it matters what all of you want." William thought about this. "Your ranch is bigger," he said. "It is," Roy agreed. "And there would be more horses. Considerably more." William nodded with the gravity of someone who has conducted a thorough analysis. "I think that would be good," he said. James had been listening to all of this with his wooden horse clutched to his chest and his eyes going between Roy and his mother. And then he said, with 3-year-old clarity that cut to the heart of the matter, "Is Roy going to be my papa?" The room was very quiet. Elsie looked at Roy, and Roy looked at James, and his face did the complicated thing she had seen that evening by the fire, the unguarded tender thing, and he said very quietly, "If you would like that, James, that would be up to you." James considered this for approximately 4 seconds. Then he climbed down from his chair, walked to Roy, and climbed into his lap with the proprietary confidence of someone who has decided the matter is settled. And Roy's arms went around him, and he looked at Elsie over the boy's head with an expression that was so full it did not have a name for it, but she felt it exactly and completely. They were married in October of 1874, on a Saturday, in Dodge City, in the small white church that had been built the previous year. Margaret Garrity stood up with Elsie, and Eduardo stood up with Roy, and the children sat in the front pew, Clara very straight and dignified in her good dress, William scrubbed and serious, James in new trousers that Roy had purchased in Dodge, and which James had pronounced very fine indeed. Elsie wore the blue wool dress, and her hair up with a spray of wild prairie asters that Clara had gathered that morning and pressed into her hand with great solemnity. And when she walked down the short aisle and Roy saw her, whatever he felt was visible in his face in a way that made Margaret Garrity produce a handkerchief immediately. The ceremony was performed by a minister named Reverend Bates, who had a beard and a good voice, and said the words as though they meant something, which they did. And when Roy took her hand to put the ring on it, she felt his hand shaking very slightly, which she found so unexpectedly affecting that she had to breathe carefully for a moment to keep her composure. He said "I do" in a voice that was low and certain, and she said it back in a voice that was clear and certain, and the thing was done. They held a small celebration at the Garrity farm that evening. Margaret had organized it as a surprise, and had recruited half the county to bring food, and there were tables set up in the yard, and a fiddle player from 3 farms over, and enough food to feed everyone twice. And Elsie stood in the midst of it with her husband's hand in hers and her children running between the tables and the lamplight, and the late October sky going orange and purple and dark above them. And she felt something that was not the desperate grinding determination that had sustained her for the past year, but something entirely different, something warm and stable and enormous, a happiness so complete that she could not actually look at it directly because the completeness of it was startling. Roy moved onto her claim that winter. It was a practical decision as well as a personal one. Her homestead was further along in its cultivation than he had realized, and the land along Garrison Creek was good land, and together they had plans for it that required being there to execute. He kept his ranch, which his foreman, a capable man named Pete Haskins, managed through the winter, with Roy making trips north twice a week, and come spring they made the harder decision together, at the table in the lamplight one February evening, talking it through with the particular thoroughness that characterized the way they made decisions together. They would build a proper house on the Garrison Creek land, a real timber frame house large enough for a real family, and Roy would sell his North Ranch to Pete Haskins, who had been trying to purchase it for 2 years, and they would consolidate their efforts and their money into the Garrison Creek property, which would become, in the clearest sense, theirs together. Building the house took most of the spring and early summer of 1875. Roy hired 2 carpenters from Dodge, and Eduardo provided the finish work, and Elsie made every decision about the house with a clarity of vision that came from years of knowing exactly what was missing from the living spaces she had occupied, and what would make a house feel like a home: windows on 3 sides of the main room to catch the prairie light, a proper kitchen with a cast iron range, a wide front porch that faced south and west so the evening light fell across it, 3 bedrooms upstairs for the children with proper wooden floors and plaster walls, and a fireplace shared between 2 of them. While the house was going up, they lived in the expanded sod house, and it was crowded and often chaotic, and there were days when the noise and the close quarters and the demands of 3 children and a ranch in progress, and a construction site in the front yard would have broken a lesser marriage. But what it actually did was tell her something important about who Roy Sheridan was in the daily texture of things. He was patient and steady in a way that held. Not the patience of someone enduring something, but the patience of someone who genuinely understood that building a life takes time and messiness, and the willingness to be in the middle of things without needing them to be finished. He was also, she discovered, a man of considerable humor when he felt comfortable, a dry, understated wit that he applied to the daily absurdities of ranch life and homesteading and parenthood with a light touch that made her laugh in ways she had not laughed in years. Genuine laughter, the surprised, involuntary kind that comes from delight rather than politeness. She also made him laugh, which she found she cared about considerably. She had always been quick, with a precise and somewhat wicked sense of the ridiculous, and she had spent the years of Thomas's illness and the subsequent grief and practicality largely suppressing this quality, because there had not seemed to be appropriate occasion for it. With Roy she unsuppressed it, and the first time she made him laugh truly, a real laugh, the unguarded kind, he looked at her afterward with an expression of pure surprise and delight and said, "Elsie, you are absolutely going to be the most interesting thing that has ever happened to me." And she said, yes, without false modesty, because she suspected it was true. The summer of 1875 was good. The crops came in well, better than the first year, because they were better at reading the land now, and because they had more of everything: more labor, more equipment, more knowledge, more of each other. The cattle Roy had brought down from the North Ranch integrated into the Garrison Creek land without drama, and by midsummer they had a proper working operation, cattle and crops together, that was sustainable and growing. Clara turned 11 that summer, and had become a child of such keen intelligence and independent opinion that it was sometimes like living with a small, impatient professor. She was reading at a level that had long since surpassed anything available at the nearest schoolhouse, 12 miles east, and Elsie began teaching her formally at home, using the books she had brought from Pennsylvania, and the new ones Roy ordered from a bookseller in Wichita, with the easy generosity of a man who understood that books were not luxuries, which was one of the many things about him that she loved with a specificity she had not expected. William, at 9, had become a genuine ranch hand, small but capable and utterly serious about his responsibilities with the horses and the cattle. Roy gave him an old quarter horse of his own, a calm gray called Soldier, and the relationship between boy and horse was so devoted and so mutual that Elsie sometimes watched them from the kitchen window with an ache of pure affection. James was 5 and entirely certain of his place in the world, which he occupied with a cheerfulness and a confidence that Elsie knew came from security, from the specific security of a child who had never had to wonder whether he was loved or wanted, And she looked at him sometimes and thought about that early winter in the sod house with the frost on the walls and the fear she had managed so carefully. And the distance between that and this was so enormous that it felt like a different life. Except it was the same life, just transformed by time and work, and a man who had ridden out of the prairie with a wheel pin and seed corn. One evening in September, with the harvest in and the new house settled and the children in bed and the first cool of fall coming through the open porch door, Roy and Elsie sat together on the wide front porch in the evening light, and she was leaning against him with his arm around her shoulders, and the prairie stretched away in front of them in the particular golden light of a Kansas September evening that was, she had decided, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "I have been thinking," she said. "You are always thinking," he said. She could hear the warmth in it. "I have been thinking about a school," she said. "There are a dozen children within a 10-mile radius of this place who have no schooling that amounts to anything. There is no teacher for 20 miles east except a man in Dodge City who charges fees that most homesteading families cannot pay. The county has money for a schoolhouse but no one to teach." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to teach?" "I have always wanted to teach," she said. "And now there is a reason to, and now we are settled enough that I can think about it, and I think, Roy, I think this county needs it badly." "It does," he said. He was not a man who withheld agreement when he agreed. "What would you need?" "A building first. But there's the old Garrity barn that James Garrity has been wanting to give over to some communal use since he built the new one." "I know it. And a letter to the county education board, and parents who will commit to sending their children in." He looked at her in the evening light and she looked at him, and the smile on his face was the full one, the sunlight on a field one, and he said, "You are going to build a school in the middle of Kansas." "I am," she said. "We are." He pulled her closer. "All right then," he said, "we are." The Garrison Creek School opened in the spring of 1876 in the renovated Garrity barn, which had been properly insulated and fitted with windows and benches, and a blackboard that Roy had hauled personally from Dodge City in the wagon. Elsie taught 15 children on the first day, ranging from Clara's age down to 5-year-olds, and she stood at the front of that room with the chalk in her hand, and the children's faces turned up toward her, and felt something that was its own kind of completion, the specific completeness of a person doing the thing they are precisely suited for. Roy sat in the back on the first day, quietly, on a bench he barely fit on, and watched her teach. And at the end of the day, when the children had gone and Clara had ridden home with William and James, he came to where she was erasing the blackboard, and he stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind and said, very quietly, into the top of her head, "There you are," as though she had been somewhere he could not quite reach and had now fully arrived. And she understood exactly what he meant and turned in his arms and held on. In the winter of 1876, they had their first child together, a boy. They named him Thomas Roy Sheridan, Thomas for the man who had built the life that led to this one, and Roy for the man who had met her on the road and changed the direction of everything. And the name seemed to Elsie to contain the whole honest truth of how she had arrived here, not by erasing what came before, but by carrying it forward into what came after. Thomas Roy Sheridan came into the world on a cold January night with Eduardo riding hard to Dodge City for the doctor and not making it back in time, and Roy delivering his own son with Margaret Garrity's steady guidance by lamplight in the upstairs bedroom, and the sound of that baby crying for the first time in the new timber frame house on Garrison Creek, Kansas, was the most extraordinary sound Roy had ever heard. And Elsie saw his face when he put the baby in her arms, and whatever was on his face was past the reach of words, and neither of them tried. He was a fine boy. Round and loud and extremely certain about his requirements, he had Roy's coloring and Elsie's expression of focused determination, and his siblings regarded him with 3 distinct varieties of fascinated attention. Clara with the considered interest of someone conducting an ongoing developmental study, William with careful tenderness that clearly cost him some dignity to display, but which he displayed anyway. And James with an enthusiasm so total that they had to establish early rules about the proximity of small children to sleeping newborns. Spring came again to the Kansas prairie, the endlessly repeating miracle of it, and the Garrison Creek land was fully a ranch now, properly fenced and organized, with good cattle and better crops, and a school in the old Garrity barn, and a timber house on the low rise above the creek with lamplight in its windows every evening and laughter inside that could be heard from the porch on a warm night. There was still difficulty. The cattle market shifted in 1877, and that year was lean, and they pulled the belt in together and got through it. There was a drought scare in the summer of that year that did not become a full drought but cost them sleep for 6 weeks. There were days when the work was grinding, and the loneliness of the prairie asserted itself in the way it does for everyone eventually. The flat featureless miles that could feel, on a bad day, like isolation rather than freedom. But on all of those days, Roy was there, and on all of those days she was there, and between them they had built something that was sufficient for hard days as well as good ones, because they had built it honestly, from compatible substance, tested by the real daily work of a real shared life. And what the difficulty showed was not weakness, but the kind of strength that only exists when two people genuinely choose each other, not because they have no other options, but because they have looked at all the options and chosen this one, again and again, every day. One afternoon in the summer of 1878, Elsie was on the front porch grading papers. The school was 2 years old now, and she had 17 students and had applied, successfully, for formal county teacher certification, which had arrived in a letter she had read 3 times while standing in the kitchen, when she heard Roy come in from the east field with William, who was now 12 and worked alongside him most days with the seriousness of a boy who intended to be a rancher and was going about it methodically. She heard them on the porch steps, Roy saying something low and William laughing at it, and then Roy's boot on the threshold and then silence, and she looked up from the papers to find him standing in the doorway looking at her with that expression, the full one, and she put down her pen. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." "You are always just looking," she said. "I am," he agreed without any apology whatsoever. She looked back down at her papers and then looked up again and said, "Roy." "Yes, I am expecting again." The silence was the same quality as the silence at the table 4 years ago, when he had said they were important because they were hers, the same quality of fullness, of something too large for ordinary sound to properly contain. Then he came across the porch in 3 steps and crouched down beside her chair and took her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he had, the whole of the man that she had come to know so completely and love so specifically. And he said, "Elsie," in the way that was different from everyone else, and then he said nothing else because he did not need to. Their second child together, and the 5th Sheridan child if you counted correctly, which all of them did, was a daughter born in March of 1879. She had Elsie's dark hair and Roy's watchful brown eyes, and an expression from her very first hour of absolute sovereign certainty. And they named her Margaret Rose Sheridan, Margaret for Margaret Garrity, who had been indispensable to both of them in the years of building, and Rose because it was spring, and the land along Garrison Creek was alive with the wild prairie roses that came every year without being asked, because that was the nature of things that were genuinely rooted. Clara, at 14, helped with the new baby with a capability that was both impressive and somewhat unsurprising, given who Clara was. William, at 12, pretended to be unaffected by the new baby and was visibly, helplessly affected by her within approximately 48 hours. James, at 8, appointed himself her official guardian and took this responsibility with complete seriousness. Thomas, who was 2, had opinions about the new baby that were complicated and frequently loud, but he had Roy's fundamental good nature and was, in the end, won over by the baby's complete indifference to his opinions, which he seemed to find unexpectedly appealing. The school continued to grow. By 1879, Elsie had 22 students and an assistant, a young woman named Grace Simmons who had come west from Ohio with her husband and had 2 years of teaching college behind her. Between them, they managed what had become, by any measure, a real school, and the Garrison Creek School had become a point of reference in the county, the kind of place that people in other parts mentioned when the question of education in the territory came up. There were things about that time in Kansas that were not simple or easy to hold alongside the happiness. The land was being remade in ways that were not always just or honest. The pressure on the remaining native peoples of the plains was unrelenting and brutal, and Elsie and Roy both knew that the homestead land they cultivated had not been empty before the settlers came, that the Homestead Act and the world that surrounded it had been built on forcible displacement that the newspapers in Dodge sometimes sanitized and sometimes celebrated, and almost never reckoned with honestly. She had talked about this with Roy on several evenings, with the directness she brought to everything, and he had agreed with her, and neither of them had an answer for it, only the acknowledgement of it, which felt insufficient but was at least honest. Roy had come to respect the Comanche and the Cheyenne in his years on the Kansas land in a way that was unusual for the time. He had had dealings with traders and leaders in his early years as a cowboy in Texas that had complicated the simple hostile narratives in ways he could not unknow, and he taught his children what he knew, the actual history, the inconvenient truth of it, which Elsie supported fully because she was a school teacher, and she believed that children who could not look at hard truths honestly would not be equipped for a world that was full of them. It did not resolve the injustice, but it was how they chose to conduct themselves inside it. Time moved in the particular way of happy years faster than you want them to, accumulating in a way that you only properly see when you look back from sufficient distance. The children grew, the ranch grew, the school grew. The town of Garrison Creek, named for the creek that Roy and Elsie's land anchored, grew up around the school, and the post office that was established in 1880 in the front room of the general store that James Garrity's son opened that year, and the community that had been a loose scattering of isolated homesteads became something more coherent, more present. Bound together by the school and the post office and the annual harvest social, and the particular interdependence of people who have learned that the prairie is large and life is uncertain, and neighbors are not optional. On a Sunday evening in October of 1880, 6 years after Elsie Redmond had driven her wagon southwest from Dodge City with everything she owned in the back, and her children pressed around her and $31 in a wool stocking against her ribs, she sat on the front porch of the timber house on Garrison Creek with her husband's arm around her shoulders, and the prairie evening going gold and purple around them, and the sound of her children inside the house, all 5 of them. Clara at 16, practicing the piano that Roy had bought the previous Christmas and brought from Wichita at extraordinary logistical effort, William arguing cheerfully with James about something, Thomas making a noise that suggested he was either building something or destroying something, and the baby Margaret's bright voice cutting through everything with the absolute authority of the youngest child, who has learned that volume is a reliable tool. Roy had his boots off and his feet on the porch rail and his hat beside him on the bench, and he was looking at the prairie the way she had come to know he did sometimes, with the quiet, attentive appreciation of a man who had chosen a place and was still, every day, glad he had chosen it. And she was looking at him in the way she had come to sometimes, catching him unaware, watching the lines of his face in the evening light. This face she had come to know so completely that it was as familiar to her as her own and more interesting. "What are you thinking?" he asked, not looking at her. "That you are a very good man," she said. He looked at her then. "Where did that come from?" "It has been there the whole time," she said. "I am just saying it out loud." He looked at her for a long moment with those quiet brown eyes and the prairie light on his face, and all the years of them together visible in the settled, knowing warmth of the way he looked at her. And then he leaned down and kissed her in the easy, complete, familiar way of two people who have kissed each other 10,000 times and intend to kiss each other 10,000 more. And she held his face in her hands the same way he had held hers in the beginning, in the wonder of the new beginning of it. And the kiss lasted a long time, because neither of them was in any hurry. When they drew apart, the prairie was going dark in the east and golden in the west, and the first stars were appearing, the Kansas stars, the stars that were brighter out here than anywhere she had ever seen them, because there was nothing to compete with them for miles in any direction. And she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "I rode west without any clear sense of what I was riding toward." "And," he said quietly, "and I was riding toward this," she said. "Exactly this. I just did not know it yet." He pulled her close and held her against him in the warm October dark, and the sound of their children inside the house was the sound of a life fully and honestly built. And the creek ran below the rise in the dark, steady and clear, the way it had run before any of them arrived and would run long after, carrying the water of the land through the land, which was, she thought, something like what a family was, something that moved and sustained and shaped the ground it passed through, something that continued. The next spring she was expecting again, their third child together, and when she told Roy, he received the news with the same wonder he had received it both times before, as though he had not yet grown accustomed to miracles, as though each one was still the first, which she thought was the correct response to miracles. And one of the things about him she had loved from the beginning without being able to say why. That child was a boy, born in November of 1881 on a clear cold night with the stars very bright over Kansas and Roy's hand in hers through all of it. And they named him Daniel Garrison Sheridan, Daniel for the simplicity and strength of the name, and Garrison for the creek and the town that the creek had given its name to. The town that had grown up around the school that Elsie had built in the renovated barn, the town that was, in some real sense, partly theirs. Clara went to Wichita for schooling in 1882 at 17, to a women's college that had opened there, and Elsie rode with her to the train and stood on the platform watching the train go and felt the specific bittersweet enormity of watching the first of her children leave into the larger world. And she thought of herself on a train platform in a different direction years before, going toward rather than staying. And she thought that Clara would be fine, better than fine, and she was right. William at 15 was as much a rancher as Roy, and wore it with quiet pride. James at 12 had Roy's pragmatic competence and Elsie's sharp intelligence, and was the most naturally social of all the children, the one who knew everyone in the county and was known by everyone, and moved through the world with an ease that made people like him on sight. Thomas was 6 and entirely himself, stubborn and funny, and devoted to his father's horses with a love that surpassed mere preference and constituted a vocation. Margaret Rose was 3 and already in command of the entire household, a fact that no one disputed because she was so cheerful about it. Garrison Creek, the town, held its first proper civic celebration in July of 1882, a 4th of July event that brought people from 20 miles in every direction. And there was a fiddle band and a barbecue and a pie contest that Margaret Garrity won for the 3rd consecutive year to nobody's particular surprise. And Elsie stood at the edge of the gathering with Roy beside her, and watched the town that had come to exist around the school she had built, and felt a satisfaction that was not pride exactly, but something more durable than pride, a sense of contribution, of having added something to a place that would remain after the addition. The territory was becoming Kansas in a fuller sense, the state of it maturing, the rough edges of the cattle town era beginning to smooth as the railroad moved further west and the cattle drives shifted, and the homesteaders accumulated and became a population, and a population became a community, and the community began to want schools and churches and civic institutions, and Elsie was already inside that transformation, had been from the beginning, building it from the ground up in the way that she built everything. In the spring of 1883, a letter arrived from Clara in Wichita, announcing that she intended to continue her education in the East, at a college in Ohio that had recently begun accepting women, and Elsie read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again and then handed it to Roy, who read it and said, "She is going to change the world." And Elsie said, "She is going to change some part of it at least." And they looked at each other with the specific pride of parents whose child is large enough to leave, which is the largest kind of success. On a September evening in 1884, 10 years almost to the month after Elsie Redmond had driven her wagon out of Dodge City into the Kansas Prairie with $31 and 3 children and 160 acres that were her own, she sat on the front porch of the timber house on Garrison Creek in the long golden light. And she had Daniel in her lap at age 2, and Margaret Rose was playing with a doll beside her. And through the open window she could hear Roy's voice inside, reading to Thomas, who was 8 and had become very specific about which stories he wanted before bed, and the voice was low and patient and entirely content. William was with the cattle. James was in town at the general store, where Garrison Simmons's daughter had taken a position behind the counter, and where James found frequent reasons to visit. Margaret Garrity had come for supper and gone home in the early evening, still the most capable and generous woman in the county, unchanged by the years except in the best ways, more of herself, which was already considerable. The Prairie in September was a different country than it was in any other month. The light was different, older, more golden, slanted in a way that made everything look slightly ancient, slightly permanent, the way things look when you know them well enough to see their essential nature. The grass was going golden, and the sky was the deep particular blue of late summer fading into fall, and the creek ran in the dusk below the rise with the sound she had come to find as familiar and as comforting as breathing. She heard Roy come out through the front door and sit beside her on the bench, and Daniel immediately transferred himself from her lap to Roy's with the gravity of a child exercising a prior claim, and Roy settled him and put his arm around Elsie's shoulders, and she leaned into him, the familiar solid warmth of him, the settledness that had been the most unexpected and the most necessary thing about loving him. "Thomas wants the story about the river again," Roy said. "He always wants the story about the river. He has excellent taste." She laughed. Margaret Rose looked up from her doll and laughed too, not knowing why, just because her mother was laughing, which was sufficient reason. Elsie looked out at the prairie in the September evening and thought about 10 years of this land, 10 years of building, 10 years of waking up in this place that had asked everything of her and given back more than she had known to ask for. She thought about the woman who had packed her children into a wagon in Dodge City in March of 1874, with nothing but stubbornness and a filed claim, and the particular courage of someone who has decided that the only option left is to go forward. She thought about the wheel that had broken, and the man who had ridden out of the north with a wheel pin in his saddlebag and seed corn on his pack horse. She thought about how that woman had been riding toward something she could not have named at the time, riding toward it without knowing it was there to be ridden toward, and how the world sometimes works by placing what you most need in the path of the direction you most need to go, and all that is required is to go. "Roy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I came west." He turned to look at her, and the September light was on his face, and Daniel was heavy and asleep in his arms, and Margaret Rose was singing something small and quiet to her doll, and Roy looked at Elsie the way he had been looking at her for 10 years, with the specific, particular, undiminished attention of a man who chose every day to look at her and found every day that the looking was worth it. "So am I," he said. "More than I could tell you." "You could try," she said. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely, the way he thought about things that mattered. Then he said, "You are the best thing on this whole piece of land, Elsie Sheridan, and this land is a very good piece of land." She laughed, and he laughed, and Margaret Rose laughed again at both of them, and the prairie evening held them all in its enormous, golden, indifferent, beautiful light. And the creek ran below the rise, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east one by one, the Kansas stars, coming home to the dark above the land the way they always did, faithful and innumerable and entirely certain of their place. She put her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes and felt the weight of the sleeping child between them and the warmth of the season, and the deep, solid permanence of the life they had built together from nothing, from seed and stubbornness, and two people willing to let themselves be known. And she breathed in and breathed out, and the prairie went on forever in every direction, and everything was exactly enough.